Hey everyone! Today we're going to talk about an amazing group of people from East Africa, the Maasai. They're famous for their unique culture, colorful traditions, and close connection to nature. So where did the Maasai come from, and how did they become such an important part of East African history? Now let's explore their story. The Maasai mostly live in southern Kenya and northern Tanzania today, but their journey began hundreds of years ago. Originally, they came from what is now Sudan. Around the 16th and 17th centuries, they started moving south, looking for better land for their animals to graze. On their way, they passed through Kenya's highlands and areas near Lake Turkana, before finally settling on the wide-open grasslands of southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. This big move shaped the Maasai into who they are today. As they traveled, the Maasai met other tribes and picked up new ideas. For example, they adopted traditions like circumcision and certain food rules from other groups they met in the Kenyan highlands. Over time, they adapted to their new home incredibly well. Raising cattle became their main focus. Cattle gave them milk, meat, and materials for clothing and tools. They even used cattle like money. For the Maasai, cattle were seen as a gift from God, and their stories and traditions emphasize that being herders is their true calling. The Maasai stories also highlight their identity as herders. One tale talks about how another group, the Dorobo, missed a divine message to collect cattle and instead turned to hunting and farming. Meanwhile, the Maasai followed the message and became the rightful caretakers of cattle. Even though some Maasai communities farmed a little, most believed that herding was their main purpose, and people with large herds were considered the most successful. Cattle were very important in Maasai society. A man's wealth and status depended on how many cattle he owned. Big herds meant wealth, but they also brought challenges. During droughts or hard times, people with fewer cattle struggled and sometimes had to farm or hunt, which was looked down upon. Despite this, the Maasai's communities were close-knit. Families and clans helped each other by sharing resources and even lending cattle when needed. The Maasai's culture wasn't just about herding. They had rich traditions and a unique way of organizing their society. Elders guided their communities, and younger members became adults through important ceremonies like circumcision. Women were in charge of household tasks, childcare, and trade. They traded milk, leather, and other cattle products with farming tribes to get grains, vegetables, and other goods. These exchanges not only helped them survive, but also brought different skills and traditions into their culture. Even with their focus on herding, the Maasai were creative and resourceful. They made use of everything their livestock provided, from milk to dung for fuel. They also shared knowledge with other tribes. For example, the Maasai performed small surgeries or removed teeth in exchange for information about medicinal plants. This cooperation shows how they thrived in their challenging environment while staying true to their traditions. And Maasai needed large areas of land for their cattle to graze, which often led to fights with nearby groups. Between 1500 and 1800, East Africa was home to many small communities, all competing for land and resources. This competition brought the Maasai into conflict with groups like the Miji Kenda, the Padala, and hunter-gatherer tribes. These fights became even more common during droughts when food and water were harder to find. The Moran were the ones who defended the Maasai. They were guided by spiritual leaders called Labans, and lived in close-knit groups. Warriors shared their belongings and trained together to prepare for battle. Their training was intense. They practiced throwing spears, wrestling, and mock fights to build strength and endurance. Hunting lions was another way for them to prove their courage, and it earned them great respect. The warriors were easy to recognize. They wore bright red robes and capes, styled their long hair with a mixture of mud, cow fat, and ochre, and carried a knife on a beaded belt. Some even wore impressive headdresses made of ostrich feathers. Before battle, they performed war dances, jumping high and showing off the skills they'd need to win. With their long spears and teamwork, they were often successful against less organized groups. By the 18th century, the Maasai controlled vast grasslands stretching from Kenya to Tanzania. but their power didn't last forever. By the 19th century, the Maasai faced new challenges. Agricultural groups, who had stronger governments and more advanced systems, began to take over. The Maasai also had internal problems, like fights between rival groups and warriors leaving to work as mercenaries for other tribes. On top of that, disease outbreaks killed many of their cattle, weakening their way of life. When European colonial powers arrived in East Africa, things got even harder for the Maasai. The British, Italians, and Germans took over much of the land, forcing the Maasai to move to less fertile areas. Despite these struggles, the Maasai held on to their independence and resisted efforts to change their traditional ways. Today, the Maasai are still deeply connected to their culture and land. One important place tied to their history is the Maasai Mara, a large game reserve in Kenya. It was created in 1961 to honor the Maasai people and their connection to the area. The reserve is famous for its wildlife, including lions and elephants, and the Great Migration, where animals move between the Maasai Mara and the Serengeti. The Maasai are still allowed to graze their cattle there, keeping their bond with the land alive.